Hey everybody, this video is called How Dare You Criticize God's Justice? And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Job, where we're going to be looking at Eliphaz denouncing Job's criticism of God's justice. So we left off on Saturday where we see that Job kind of goes on to question God's justice and the fairness of God's justice. And today we're going to look at Eliphaz take what Job said and run with it to come against him more. So Job chapter 22 verse 1 through 3 starting out says, Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, Can a man be profitable to God, though he who is wise may be profitable to himself? Is it any pleasure to the Almighty that you are righteous, or is it gain to him that you make your ways blameless? So we now enter the third cycle of speeches given by Job and his friends that are remaining. With Zophar, as mentioned on Saturday, he abstains through chapter 31. And we will see today how Eliphaz's last speech gets nasty with Job as he grows in his frustration with Job. And Eliphaz thought that Job thought too highly of himself, and we're going to see that in today's chapter. And Eliphaz, he saw Job as arrogant, and he wanted Job to consider that God needed nothing from him and that Job added nothing to God. And sure, Eliphaz certainly had correct theology, and God doesn't need Job in the way that Job needs God, just like God doesn't need us like the way we need God. And nevertheless, his application of this principle was wrong in the context in the book of Job, because it was indeed a pleasure to the Almighty that Job was righteous, as we saw in chapters 1 and 2. And go back and rewatch those if you haven't seen those chapters back in, I think, November. And according to those chapters, it was indeed a gain to him that Job made his ways blameless. In verse 4 through 11, it says, Is it because of your fear of him that he corrects you and enters into judgment with you? Is not your wickedness great and your iniquity without end? For you have taken pledges from your brother for no reason, and stripped the naked of their clothing. You have not given the weary water to drink, and you have withheld bread from the hungry. But the mighty man possessed the land, and the honorable man dwelt with it in it. You have sent widows away empty, and the strength of the fatherless was crushed. Therefore snares are all around you, and suddenly fear troubles you, or darkness that you cannot see, and an abundance of water covers you. So this miserable comforter accused Job of wickedness that was great. And he goes on to name various sins against humanity as the reasons for Job's troubles. And remember that Job and none of his friends could see the setting taking place in Job's life. They cannot see the heavenly scenes that we see in chapters 1 and 2. And he accused Job of mainly being filled with greed, and he accuses Job of cruelty for the sake of riches, as Job was once rich. And it's what could make most sense. In verse 12 through 20 says, Is not God in the height of heaven, and see the highest stars, how lofty they are? And you say, What does God know? Can he judge through the deep darkness? Thick clouds cover him, so that he cannot see. And he walks above the circle of heaven. Will you keep to the old way, which wicked men have trod, who were cut down before their time, whose foundations were swept away by a flood? They said to God, Depart from us. What can the Almighty do to them? And he filled their houses with good things, but the counsel of the wicked is far from me. The righteous see it and are glad, and the innocent laugh at them. Surely our adversaries are cut down, and the fire consumes their remnant. So we see verses 12 through 20, the counselor repeated the emphasis on the almighty nature of God, saying that God was so exalted and superior that he had no direct concern at all with Job. And God didn't care personally about his complaints and his claims to righteousness. This is how Eliphaz felt. And Eliphaz is saying that God was not involved in the trivia of his life. And again, the fate of the wicked was expressed by the simplistic idea that all suffering comes from sin. And contrary to what Job had argued, the wicked characteristically dies prematurely, and Job's claim that God prospered them was counsel that Eliphaz rejected. He did not believe in that type of theology or belief. And Eliphaz preaches the might and majesty and the sovereignty of God to Job as the basics of theology, as Job wouldn't admit to his error, so then Job must be fundamentally wrong in his understanding of God. So we see Eliphaz kind of takes on, the theologian, and he confronts Job with theology. And Eliphaz warned Job to not follow the wickedness, as he should reflect on the time when people were swept away by a flood, which most likely refers to the flood of Noah's time here. And Eliphaz argues that the righteous are happy for God's judgments. And it was as another way for Eliphaz to say that Job was wicked and not righteous, because he did not rejoice in the judgments of God. In verse 21 through 30, says, "Now acquaint yourself with him, and be at peace. Thereby good will come to you. Receive, please, the instruction from his mouth, and lay up his words in your heart. If you return to the Almighty, you will be built up. You will remove iniquity far from your tents. Then you will lay your gold in the dust, and the gold of Ophir among the stones of the brooks. Yes, the Almighty will be your gold and your precious silver. For then you will have your delight in the Almighty, and lift up your face to God. You will make your prayers to him. He will hear you, and you will pay your vows. You will also declare a thing, and it will be established for you. So light will shine on your ways. And when they cast you down, and you say exaltation will come, then he will save the humble persons." Humble person. He will even deliver one who is not innocent, yet he will be delivered by the purity of your hands. So that's the rest of chapter 22 here. And so we see in the ending here that Eliphaz painted a picture of the life of blessing in store of Job, if only he would just lay down his pride, and he would humble himself, and he would return to God and repent of his sin. And so once again, Eliphaz is emphasizing that he didn't believe that Job was innocent. And Eliphaz thought, Job, if you would just shut up with your speeches, stop complaining, and just listen to us, Job. Repent, and everything will be fine. That is the tone that Eliphaz is saying here. In verse 24, I just want to point out the location of Ophir is an unknown location, with a land that was considered with high quality gold, seen back in Genesis 10:29. And in verse 21, it says, "Now acquaint yourself with him, and be at peace. Thereby good will come to you." So verse 21 would have been great advice for Job if his problems did indeed stem from sin. Yet we know the bigger pictures, as I've said many, many times throughout Job so far in chapters 1 and 2, that wasn't the case. We know exactly why Job is going through his troubles. And Eliphaz assumed much because Job was agonizing with God instead of finding delight in him. And Job's agony with God was a real, though temporary, phenomenon. And once again, Eliphaz and Job's other friend's solution was for Job to confess these deep sins that he's hiding. his great sins that had brought this calamity upon his life. And then he would receive God's restoration. So to wrap up today's chapter, we look today at Eliphaz speaking for the last time as he started out attacking Job's character, asking Job, what good was he to God? In verse 4:11, we see that Eliphaz goes on with his theology of describing Job's great wickedness. In verse 12 through 20, Eliphaz goes on to attack Job's theology, contrasting between the wicked and the righteous. He thinks that Job doesn't understand God. And we see that the chapter ends with Eliphaz continuing to counsel Job to make himself right with God, to get right with God. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next as we'll look at Job's desire to appear before God. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. We'll see you for our next study. God bless.